Welcome everyone to our Friday night episode of Faith Unaltered. I'm just one of the amazing co-hosts that you have with you this evening. To my left or right, whichever way we're facing now, for you anyway, is my brother from another mother, the California King, Joshua Davidson. We have Dale Glover joining us, the Canadian King, and our special guest this night, Phil Bair, the author of the book that we will be discussing that's linked in the description, Machines Don't Laugh, which is, by the way, is a very short, very concise, but very, very good refutation to some of the generalizing uh, atheistic arguments that are brought to the table whenever atheist and theist debate. And so I recommend that book. You can get it on Amazon. Find it in the description below. Before we begin tonight, I just want to say I want to make one quick announcement that this will potentially be my last episode before I go on my month-and-a-half break. My wife has still not delivered our baby girl yet. It's coming. She is coming. I just don't know when. And so I'm assuming she will be here very, very soon. My wife is getting closer and closer. Tuesday will be 39 weeks that she has been cooking our little girl. And she had Kelsey, 39 weeks and 4 days last time. Now, I know every pregnancy is different, but we are getting to that mark where she had Kelsey last time. And so this will potentially be my last episode before I take my month-and-a-half break. Josh, Dane, Carrie, David, and Dell, if we need you, I'm sure that you would help the guys out.
Absolutely.
Fair enough. Thank you for that. But they will continue to run while I am gone. And so please be praying for me. Please be praying for my family, that Lacey has a good delivery, that Eden is healthy, and that we can get back to normal after she's here very, very soon. So with that being said, please pray for me and my family whenever y'all do your nightly and daily prayers. So thank you for that. Also, one more quick announcement. We are looking for the new co-host of... No, I'm just playing. Not yet. Maybe soon. Maybe soon. That might be happening. We're always looking for... what's the word I want to look for? Never mind. We're always looking for people that might
like-minded
be
individuals.
Yeah, I like that. We're always thinking about expanding Faith Unaltered, and so I would not be opposed to hosting a new segment. We've or not hosting, but producing a new segment, I should say. We've already started 2 of them this year. 3 Crowns, hosted by Dane Von Ace and Carrie Griffles, Pilgrims in the Holy Land. But no, in all honesty, we are looking for someone who can make intro videos. That was brought up in a discussion between me and the other host today, and so we are willing to pay cash money for that, or digital money, whatever you accept, to produce for us between a 30 and 45-second video. So if you or someone you know does that type of work, please get with me. Email me, faithunaltered@gmail.com, or if you have me on Facebook, please send me a message. But we're looking for someone to make us a 30 to 45-second intro video that we can promote to different platforms like that. So thank you for that. We really appreciate it. And without further ado, Phil Bair, thank you so much for joining us tonight, sir. If you would, before we jump in to your book, would you take a few minutes to introduce yourself for those that may not know you just yet? You've been on our show a few times now, but for those that don't know you, would you take a few moments to introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, hi. I'm pretty much a philosophical nobody. But I have been a Christian. I've been a Christian since I was about, I think, 13 years old. And I went to University of Iowa to study philosophy, got hammered by my philosophy professors, strayed away from the Christian faith. Um, and my mother was extremely panicked about that. So she sent me a book by a guy named Francis Schaeffer because she knew that I was passionate about philosophy. So all of her friends were telling her, send him a book by a Christian philosopher. Maybe he'll read that, and maybe that'll make some sense to him. So she did that, and that book changed my life, actually.
Mm.
Um, and so I've been involved in Christian apologetics, and in tons and tons of various issues related to the Christian worldview ever since. And that spans several decades now. I have been a consultant for a cultural apologetics organization called Rivendell,
Mhm.
where I did tons of speaking, debating, um, lecturing in conferences and seminars and workshops on the Christian worldview, and uh, confronting the current trends that are occurring in our society and our culture and so on. So, but I'm always learning new things, and I've learned something from your guests and from you guys, and so I really appreciate the opportunity to continue to grow and expand, in these areas. So I don't know, how's that?
That's perfect, perfect, and we thank you for the compliments. That's awesome. We're always if someone and this and I'm speaking to myself more than anybody at this point, but if someone isn't willing to learn, there's a problem. No matter who you are, no matter how old you are, no longer how long you've been in the game, there's always something new I think to grasp, and that's what I love about theology and especially the Christian religion is that there is a vast sea of information out there that I think and the beautiful thing about it is I think we'll spend eternity learning about God. God is infinite, and therefore there will be an infinite amount of information to learn about Him as we become more like Him in our sanctification and theosis. And so I love that fact. I can't stop thinking about that sometimes, and just how much that will apply to us, really. And Josh knows what I mean by reality at that point. One day, and so very much so. I can't wait to have that veil dropped to be able to see what's on the other side for all of us. And so, with that being said, uh, so again, thank you for joining us. You do so you've released a book now. This is I was trying to figure it out, and I think correct me if I'm wrong, Phil. So you've released a few books now, namely two that have been pretty important. We haven't done an interview on the one yet, but we're getting to this one now. But you've written two books specifically Calvin's Desperation and Machines Don't Laugh. You've written 5 books. Right. Um, my question was real quick which came first? Did Calvin's Desperation come after Machines Don't Laugh, or was that vice versa?
Calvin's Desperation was just released in the last 6 months,
I thought so.
so
Okay.
it's my most recent book. It's also my longest book. So the more I write, apparently. I don't know if that's a good thing or not, but I wrote Machines Don't Laugh in 2016.
Okay.
And I spent 2 years writing Calvin's Desperation. So that started in 2021 and then was released in 2023. So, and I wrote Machines Don't Laugh before I met a lot of the friends that I have now in apologetics. I wrote it before I met Tim Stratton, who's now become a dear friend of mine.
Yeah.
And um, but it turns out that there are tons of scholars and thinkers, and then kind of puny guys like me who have been making very similar arguments. And so there's actually a family of arguments and a family of narratives that the apologetics community has been communicating. And
Mm-hmm.
I didn't realize that what I was saying was similar to what a lot of other apologists have been saying, and that so we're giving each other a lot of traction with these issues. And I think some of them, well, most of them are just absolutely vital as in our time right now. So I wrote Machines Don't Laugh because I was concerned about the high rate of deconversion among high profile Christians and celebrities and pastors and even scholars. So I wrote that out of that kind of concern, but I wanted to write something that was easily digestible, from the layman, instead of something that was only going to be meaningful or helpful to somebody who's had lots and lots of training in all these issues and these disciplines. So
Right.
I'm trying to trying to speak in the intersection between the street and the academy, and it's not an easy thing to do, but I think it's possible, and I think it's something that we need to be doing. So
Amen. And I respect that because that's exactly what we're trying to do here at Faith Unaltered is bring the academia down to the lay level position. And that in and of itself is a task. And so I commend you for that, Phil. But you've kind of already answered the first part of the first question that I had for you about what was
sorry.
it exactly. No, that's fine. Perfectly fine. But what was it that inspired you to write the book? But I like the title, and I love the some of the irony that is in your book. It's really funny the way you bring out some of that stuff. But the title is the full title: "Machines Don't Laugh: Confronting General Arguments from Atheist dot 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 again." And so my question is at this point: is there an end game for this redundancy that's foreseeable to you in the near future? You talk about in the introduction of your book that atheists just basically keep rehashing the same arguments after Christians have already confronted them, have already debunked the majority, if not all, of these claims. But is there an end goal that you see, and if so, what does that look like to you?
Well, one of them is a rather emotional and personal end goal for me, um, and that is to prevent as many deconversions as I possibly can. Um,
Amen.
because the fact of the matter is, Christians are notorious for not being very well read on a lot of the literature in atheism and a lot of the literature in Christian apologetics as well. So
Mm-hmm.
um, there's kind of a general uh, unawareness of these issues, and so and the other problem is that that there's a lack uh, of an apologetics contingent in the church. And I think we talked about that a little bit last time as well. We may have, I'm not sure. I've talked about it with, on one of these podcasts, but
Yeah.
uh, my heart breaks for people who have been drawn away from their faith because of the fallacies of atheism.
Mm-hmm.
And and every single problem that a Christian was confronting or has confronted, um, that drew them away from the faith and caused them to deconvert is always based on a fallacy. There's always a logical fallacy involved, and there's always an emotional appeal that is extremely deceptive. And part of the reason I wrote this book was because I wanted to have something that the average Christian could read and could help prevent them from falling away from the Christian faith. And so I drew from a lot of different ideas, that have come down through the centuries, actually. I mean, I've added a little bit of my own spices here and there, but
Yeah.
I wanted something that people who were Christians and have a sincere faith in Christ could read and use as kind of a shield against all these attacks from atheism, because they're always based on fallacies. I've never ever heard a reason why somebody deconverted that was actually rational and coherent.
Mm. That well, to that point, then let me just lead into my third question. So you mentioned in the book, and I don't real quick. So somebody made it mention in the comments that my mic was a little bit low. Is that better? If
A
so,
bit.
is it okay? I can turn it up just a little bit more. I just don't want to clip. Um, but okay, so you mentioned in the book, and I'm just going to quote it. So the fact is, Christians are becoming former Christians because of the seductive fallacies of atheism at an alarming rate. My question is, why do you think this is, given that Christians have responded to and are responding to and refuting these claims made by atheists like Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins?
Yeah, and we've actually already alluded to a lot of these. The lack of
Mm-hmm.
apologetics in the church.
Yeah.
Um, it just seems like the average evangelical church has this severe distaste for apologetics and
Mm-hmm.
for reasoning, to the conclusions that we cherish in the Christian faith. Um, and I am a worship leader. Part of my trade is a worship leader. So I've been a worship pastor in several different evangelical churches, and I've discovered that most of the time churches don't want a theologically astute worship pastor. They just want a worship pastor that will just simply do as he's told, and do the songs that they tell him to do, and to just kind of keep his mouth shut, because uh, I don't think they want to hear a lot of the things that I'm concerned about. Um, so there's this lack of apologetics in the church. Apologetics usually has to be an outside church endeavor, and I find that rather tragic, to be real honest with you.
Sure.
But I think the lack of apologetics in the church is one reason why so many Christians are torn away from the faith. It's because they're not equipped, to be able to answer, the skeptics and the challenges from the secular community and so on.
Yeah.
But there is a lack of training in critical thinking among Christians as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I also find that disturbing and troubling and tragic, um, because not only does apologetics equip a Christian to be able to defend the faith and to be able to resist the attacks of the enemy, but training in critical thinking does the same thing. Because if you're trained in critical thinking and the rules of inference and logic, then you can spot logical fallacies a mile away. And if that's the case,
Right.
you'll be able to be in a much better position to be able to resist the attacks and to refute and defend yourself against the attacks of atheism. And another problem that I've actually seen, and then another reason why I wrote the book, is that the new atheists, the four horsemen of the atheist apocalypse, which one of them is gone, but Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and Daniel Dennett, Sam Harris,
Mm-hmm.
they are aggressively attacking the community of believers.
Mm-hmm.
It used to be that atheists were rather docile and they were content to just simply coexist with the religious community. But that's not true anymore. I think in the last decade or two, I think that atheists have become extremely aggressive. Um, and they're not content to just not believe in God. They don't want anybody else to believe in God either. So
Mm-hmm.
they're out there they're on the warpath, and that represents uh, a particular danger to the body of Christ. Because if you've got people who are defenseless in the body of Christ, and you've got atheists that are aggressive and they're on the attack, they're doing attack maneuvers, then
Mm-hmm.
we're in trouble.
Yeah.
We have a real problem on our hands because of that. So um, most Christians are not very well read in the scholarly responses to atheism, and we kind of alluded to that before.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other thing that I've noticed is that the influence of postmodernism weakens the intellectual integrity of the average Christian and the Christian faith itself, even. Um, and so that encourages sloppy thinking or no thinking at all. And we're called upon in Scripture to be ready to give a defense of the reason, or ready to give a reason of the hope that's within us.
Right.
And postmodernism is like a corrosive agent against that agenda of being able to give a reason, for the faith that's in us. And then another reason I wrote the book Calvin's Desperation is because I believe that Calvinism is also a real danger to the integrity of people's faith. A lot of the high profile Christians who have abandoned the faith have been Calvinists.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason they've abandoned the case has a lot to do with the principles and the ideas of Calvinism.
Mm-hmm.
Because if God is a God of deterministic causality over all things that occur in the universe and over everything about mankind, then that means that he must be the author of evil. And Christians who are trying to live a Christian life and follow a God who is morally perfect, that's a huge stumbling block for Christians.
Yeah.
And the Calvinists would deny that they believe that God is evil, but the problem is that their ideology necessarily implies that he's evil. So I think that's a huge problem. So there are just a lot of reasons why Christians are falling away, and I see this as just an attack of evil upon the body of Christ, and I think we need to mount a defense against it and a counteroffensive, as well. So
Yeah, to that point, so a couple things I want to say real quick, and then I want to hand it over to Dale because he said he's got some follow-up questions. But after reading your book, that's exactly why I wanted and felt more compelled to do this interview with you, is to really get some content, some more content out into the public, different social media platforms and things of that nature to equip. And so this, for our audience anyway, let me talk to y'all for a second. This is not just going to be, it's going to be an interview, yes, but we're going to get into some practical responses here in just a moment. I'm going to, I've got 5 maybe 5 objections that Phil raises in his book. So I encourage y'all, go out and buy the book, because this by no means is going to be a summary of what's in there, because I skipped over a couple things. So you definitely want to get the book. But I do want to make this practical as well. And so I'm going to be raising objections to Phil. And given that Dell is here as well, being trained in philosophy, I would love to hear how he would respond to some of these, as well as Josh too. But just a couple things. So in regards to the idea, and one of the toughest things I have an issue with in speaking about apologetics is recognizing some of these different fallacies that are very controversial in a sense, but that's akin to philosophical statements. However, I ran into a video the other day, and so and what's amazing about YouTube is that you can get a lot of information really, really quick. And so if I can find this video again, it's basically a 10-minute video that lists and explains what these different fallacies are in reasoning, in philosophy, and breaks them down to where, just kind of like what we're doing. You don't have to go out and buy $100 philosophy book just to figure out what these different fallacies are. This guy breaks them down in a very nice, concise way that's easily understandable. It gives examples of these different fallacies. And if I can link it, I would encourage people to watch that video, because for me anyway, and I'm sure others are like this, or maybe I'm just the ugly duckling in this area, but I have a hard time remembering what all the fallacies are. There's so many of them, but once you hear a couple while you're practicing this, whether you're listening and listen to fallacy or listen to just conversations every day, people say fallacies and they don't even know they're doing it, right? And if you can start catching on to that and train your ear for that. That way, if you're in an apologetic scenario, you're actually having a conversation with or debating someone else, you can train yourself to pick up, oh, there's that fallacy, and then call them out on it. So I will link to that video in the description below if I can find it again, because it was so helpful. But other than that, I agree, Phil, with you 100%. There is a lack of reading, and whenever going through your book, seeing the fallacies that are leading people away, it almost makes you want to facepalm because they're so evident. Like you brought up Bart Ehrman in your book, for example. Well, why, Bart, did you leave? You had a conversation with him, and he leaves, and I've got the quote here. Uh, yeah, he says he couldn't accept the idea that a good God could allow so much suffering in the world. And that's something David, our co-host, and please pray for him. I don't know what's going on with David tonight. He said he was going to be here, but he's not, and we haven't heard from him. At least I haven't heard from him. So please pray for him. I'm not too sure what's going on there. But he's doing his master thesis on theodicy. Dale talks about theodicy all the time on Faith Unaltered and on his channel. And so, and I know Josh has as well. So with that being said, I mean, it's not like this topic's not addressed. I don't know if it's laziness. I don't know what it is, but it's not like the content's out there. And so, again, I would encourage our audience to please share this type of content, whether it's this video, please share this video, obviously, but other videos like this, because you're absolutely right, Phil. There is a lack of teaching in the apologetics field, and that's why Christians are falling away, and it's sad. But Dell, I know you said you had a couple questions, couple follow-ups, so I will turn it over to you, brother.
Real quick, though, Tyler, I
Yeah.
wanted to mention something about the book. And I don't want to take away from Dale at all, but I think this is important. When I was thinking about the fact that Christians often are not well read and they don't have the kind of self-discipline that it takes to be able to study these issues and become aware of them. Part of the reason is because when you pick up your average book on apologetics, it's that thick, and it is so discouraging.
Yeah.
And there's a lack of motivation out there because the average Christian doesn't want to read a 500-page book on apologetics. And not only that, what makes it worse is that a lot of times these books are extremely academic and technical. And so they have to have a dictionary next to them in order to get through one sentence, and it's just too overwhelming for the average Christian. When I wrote Machines Don't Laugh, I decided I'm going to write a book that's barely over 100 pages, and that's easy to read, and that people wouldn't be scared away by, and I think that's a lot of that's about what you were mentioning earlier, is that we want to bring this down to the level of the street. And that's why I deliberately made sure that this was a short book, because that way somebody could read it in an afternoon, and it's just not so intimidating.
Right.
So hopefully that kind of, helps to get people over that hurdle a little bit. I'm trying to help them out in that area, so,
yeah.
But I really want to hear what Dale has to say. So I'm going to shut up now.
Well, just real quick before, and I'm not trying to take away, so I'll give you the floor after this, I promise, brother. But with what you just said, Phil, I listened to your book in less than 8 hours. And so I started it, finished it. I was at work one night and listening to it, and I couldn't believe it was already over. I was like, wait a minute, there's got to be more to this. But only, I think Amazon listed as 110 pages. In the version that I got, it was 122. So somewhere between there. But the point is yes, you can listen to it, or if you have a PDF reader or something to that effect, or read it within a very, very short setting. So that's what I liked about it. All right, Dale, over to you, brother.
Awesome. I mean, here I am walking on water in the Sea of Galilee. And, this is
that
actually,
you are.
Yep, it is actually the Sea of Galilee there. But yeah, so I wanted
That's
to ask,
very cool.
Awesome. Yeah, it was awesome. I love that trip. So thank you for pointing that out, Jano, in the audience. But I've got two follow-up questions based on Tyler's third question here for you. And I guess I'll start with the second one, since Tyler mentioned logical fallacies and that sort of thing. I want to flip it over though and get your feedback on the atheists, because I've noticed in debating atheists online, a lot of atheists will use appeal like logical fallacies as a way of dismissing arguments or conclusions, kind of in a very yeah, most of the time the online atheists misunderstand it, but even when they get it right, there is this. It's kind of a way of dismissing the argument of a Christian theist and ending substantive conversations and that sort of thing, rather than following the principle of charity and trying to steel man the other side and get to the real thing. So, yeah, I just wanted to kind of get your take, Phil, on, do you think the use of logical fallacies can lead to people committing the fallacy, and stuff like that, and that blocks some substantive communication between both sides if we're just trying to look for, oh, you've got this logical fallacy here, and therefore I'm just going to dismiss it. And just before I hand it over to you, Phil, Tyler, a great website on a popular level, if you want to get to know some of the main logical fallacies, is thou shall not commit logicalfallacies.com. Yeah, it's a great resource as well. Yeah, over to you, Phil. Do you think appealing to logical fallacies is kind of inhibiting the conversation because it's being misused by people, by atheists?
Well, that's kind of a two-edged sword, because it's critical that we identify logical fallacies, and the reason it's so critical is because logical fallacies are the reason so many Christians are dropping their Christian faith. So it has to play a rather central role in dealing with atheism, because and the subtitle of the book is Confronting the Fallacies of Atheism. Again, so. And we can't let atheists get away with these logical fallacies. We have to expose them. That I think that's an imperative that we have as Christians and as apologists. Yeah. But we need to understand that just because you've exposed a fallacy in somebody's argument does not mean that you have proven their conclusion false. And so if you want to use logical fallacies in your range of weaponry against atheism, they need to be complemented by positive arguments from our side that show that God exists, and to show that the fallacies of atheism do not show that God does not exist. And so I think they need to be put in their place. Maybe possibly one of the reasons why fallacies could be unproductive is that that's all we're doing. If all we're doing is pointing out logical fallacies, then we could be misguided at that point. And to me, when I hear the term the fallacy, when I hear that term, I interpret it mainly as the assumption that if I just simply point out logical fallacies in somebody's argument, I've automatically refuted their conclusions. What the fallacies do is the fallacies point out that the arguments that the other side is using do not establish the truth of their conclusion. But in the book, I not only point out the fallacies of atheism, I present a litany of arguments in favor of theism. And if you can show that a given worldview is false because it's self-defeating and or otherwise, then you've automatically proven that the opposite of their conclusions are true. So if you prove the proposition God does not exist false, you've automatically proven the proposition God does exist true. And so I think that's kind of the key, is as far as I'm concerned. And obviously everything needs to be done charitably. But I can't. I just can't resist pointing out the uncharitable nature of a lot of these atheists in their debates. And so if we are able to get a debate going with Lawrence Krauss, I'm going to have a really, really hard time resisting, saying in the introduction, now Lawrence Krauss is going to jump up and down, throw feces around the room, and screech like a monkey, but just don't let that mislead you and don't let that distract you from the real issues, But if I say that, it's going to be uncharitable, even though I want to say it so badly, So yeah, I think perspective is really the best, the best way to address the points that you brought up, because they're very valid points, and I think that we can get out of proportion, and I think if we do that, we can make a mistake, and we can become unproductive at that point. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, I fully agree. I mean, the logical fallacies are critical. They're important. They expose false reasoning and so that's the way they're meant to be used in conjunction with the principle of charity, right? Where we're not misusing them and that sort of thing. So, all right, cool. So my second question, so Tyler also asked in his question 3, so it was kind of mentioned that, look, Christians have responded to the new atheist arguments from Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, but yet they just kind of ignore it. They keep giving the same points and stuff like that over and over again, the same arguments, despite there being Christian responses. Now I wanted to flip it, because the atheists say this, these new atheists, they say the same things. For example, I've heard them in their debates or in their books, and they'll say, well, look, these Christian arguments for the existence of God, they've been refuted since the 1300s. They've been refuted. So, but yet you Christians keep touting these same arguments, despite the fact that we've already refuted them centuries ago. Do you see that there's a difference between there, or what do you make of this claim that the atheists are saying we've already responded to all your Christian arguments or something? Is that the same as what Tyler's saying? Well, Christians have responded to the atheist thing, so they should give it up already.
Yeah. I think the best approach to that kind of claim is to simply say, okay, we're saying that we've refuted your arguments. You're saying that you've refuted ours. If we just stop there, then we're not going to get anywhere. So the only thing that we can do is we can address the arguments again, one by one. And if the atheist says we've refuted your whatever it happens to be, we've refuted your cosmological argument, then I would ask them, how have you refuted it? Please explain to me how you've refuted that argument. And I'm happy to explain to you how we have refuted the arguments of the atheists. And so I think the only way to really address that situation is to simply buckle down and do the hard work, and that's why I wrote the book that I wrote. And that's why I would like to have a debate with Lawrence Krauss, because if he really has refuted the arguments of the theists, then I would like to hear him explain how. And to be real honest with you, I've read numerous books by atheists, Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, Victor Stenger, Stephen Hawking, and I have never heard any refutation of any theistic argument in any of those books. I've listened to tons of debates by the same people, and I have never heard them refute the arguments of the theists. The only thing I have heard them do is ridicule the theists. And so if the word refute and the word ridicule mean the same thing, then I would agree with them. Yes, you have refuted the arguments of the theists because you've ridiculed them all. But I've never heard them refute any of them. So unless I'm just really, really ignorant, about these issues, and I don't think I'm too ignorant, I think I kind of know a little bit about this subject. I would like to have them point out where they have refuted those arguments.
Yeah, they're conflating a reaction is not the same as a response, a substantive response, right? So
right.
All right, cool. I guess Josh, over to you if you have any questions on the basis of the first 3 questions.
Man, I just have to say I'm glad to be here. I haven't had much of a reason to poke in yet. I've just been listening really carefully, and I agree with basically everything you've said so far. I feel like we've covered a whole lot of ground, so I don't want to like rehash everything. There's a couple of things that you said that I didn't want to interrupt the flow, what was being said in order to say something. You know what I mean? So I wanted to kind of circle back to the idea of the Calvinists, and let's say the prominent names in Christianity who are walking away from the faith publicly right now. Some of them are Calvinists. I'd say that's not necessarily a new trend, but it's one that's become a lot more prominent in our awareness because we all have connections via online things and social networks and, viral videos and so forth. So you're going to, have a whole lot more spread of the information a lot more quickly in the world that we're in now. So that has a lot to do with where a seemingly sudden sense of urgency might be coming from, is that we're all now in the same sphere, in a place where you're going to encounter these people, even if you live in a small town in the middle of nowhere with a bunch of really nice, most of them are Christian folk. They all probably go to the same church, you know what I mean? Or the same series of churches, and everybody knows each other. You could live in that neighborhood, and still, if you are a part of any online community, you're probably going to encounter things like this. And so that's why I think the uptick in the sense of relevance and urgency that's being seen right now, or that we're trying to bring attention to, is that we're all now sharing a common space where even if you in your immediate, say, sphere of influence are not going to encounter, let's say, a very militant atheist at work or in your school or at your supermarket or whatever, you're more than likely going to encounter them just having been on YouTube for more than 5 minutes, you know what I mean, and watching Christian content, or watching anything that's relevant to Christianity. You're going to have this rampant clickbait culture that's going on that amplifies this kind of weird, soundbite back and forth. And so I think it's the case that, even if we can point out that there are Calvinists who are leaving the faith, right? It's interesting to note that you said they were leaving because of their Calvinism. I think also they could perhaps be staying away because of their Calvinism as well. And some of it may not even have to do with atheism. It has to do with, like you were saying before, thinking clearly and pointing out where fallacious thinking is, so that you don't fall prey to your own complacent, I'm fine where I'm at kind of attitude. You know what I mean? So I think that also is kind of relevant to what we were talking about, but isn't really the undertone of what you guys were discussing. It's kind of like, I think the reason perhaps why a lot of Christians have a struggle with noticing things like that is because we only really see or hear things that are relevant to us, right? And so if you haven't readily encountered things like this, or when you had, you simply dismissed it because it didn't seem relevant to you, I think you're doing yourself a great disservice. You know what I mean? So it's kind of one of those things where preventative medicine sort of thing, you know what I mean? Like confronting things beforehand. Perhaps let's say this could be something like you guys were talking about, the apologetics role in the local church, and perhaps this is a role that could be undertaken by the pastors and the elders, is actually to perhaps openly challenge the people who are in their church to think about things in a way that gets them ready to be confronted. You know what I mean? Not necessarily just offer atheistic questions so that you can like push their doubt button so you have a reason to tell them an answer, but more so kind of give them a reason why they should already have an answer so that it can be prepared, because this actually is a scriptural principle to be ready to give an answer for the hope that you have, right? And I think that to Dale's point, people are in the landscape that we're using now, especially in the online sphere, are not necessarily ready to give an answer for the hope that's within them. More so, they're ready to give an answer for why they're right and you're wrong, and that's why the attitude comes off as really dismissive, especially if it's really just to say, "Oh, you used a fallacious argument, therefore I don't have to listen or deal with you." You know what I mean? And like you said, it's really this underlying assumption. Well, then I just have disproven everything that you think. And obviously, if you use a fallacy, you're probably some, peon that doesn't know anything. So I can just dismiss you, you know what I mean? And treat it that. And I think that Dale's point about being charitable and trying to, let's say, assume the person you're talking to might know something you don't. So you should actually listen. right? Like that's a good practice, whether you're an atheist or a Christian, but especially for the Christians. It is a great idea for you, especially in in-house conversations, let's say, but also when you're talking with unbelievers or even having an apologetics back and forth with somebody who's a pretty staunch atheist or something like that. You should be listening very carefully, if not to find fallacies, at least to find where you have something of overlap so you can make relevant statements that are going to stick with this person instead of just taking your metaphysical machete and hacking away at branches. Pay attention. That's really, I think, attention is the first sacrifice you should make in relation to your apologetics. Is you really, really need to pay attention, and you really should exercise the kind of charity that Dale was describing. But that's pretty much what I've been burning back here for a while.
Yeah, partly what I've noticed is that these fallacies are actually the pillars of the atheist narrative. And that's one reason why, I want people to learn how to address them so much. And absolutely, doing it in humility is a challenge, because I've just had the blind luck privilege of being able to talk to high profile atheists and evolutionary scientists. I was able to have a conversation with Stephen Jay Gould in the early 90s. And one of the things that I noticed about that entire environment is that Stephen Jay Gould was traveling around the country and he was peddling his atheistic evolutionary biology to a great many people. I mean, that was at in the Denver Center for the Performing Arts, one of the huge auditoriums, and it was absolutely packed full of thousands of people. And so he had an enormous audience, and the other atheists have an enormous audience as well. And so as far as where we're actually drawing the battle lines, that became very obvious to me, and it's even more obvious now because of what you mentioned. Is that the mass communication, the digital online communication that we have at our disposal now, that takes the audience of thousands that someone like Stephen Jay Gould has, and it magnifies it to audiences of tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands and perhaps even millions. That's what we're up against. And so, sometimes we can hack away at the branches and fail to address the root, but also there are other times when what we're hacking away at are the roots. Because I mentioned in the book that these fallacies and these narratives coming from the atheists, they're all saying the same thing. And in many cases, that's about all they're saying. They're ridiculing theism, and they're doing it within the context of a long-winded book about science. So Richard Dawkins, if you read his book, The God Delusion, a lot of his book, and especially one of the most recent ones, which is Outgrowing God, written by Richard Dawkins, that book mainly consists of two things. One, long-winded descriptions of how biology works and how biological life forms work and how they supposedly evolve and so on, and ridicule of Christian theism. Those are the two primary. That's the primary content of that book. It's twofold. And so people will get caught up in these scientific narratives, and they'll be so fascinated, with the life of some kind of termite or something. And Dawkins and people like that will go on and on and on, several chapters about sometimes just about one life form. And they're describing all these things. And what it does is it creates the illusion in the mind of the reader that, oh my gosh, this is just overwhelming evidence for evolution. This is overwhelming evidence for the fact that nature can actually self-organize, and nature can actually come up with intelligence without the help of any intelligent creator. And then when you combine that with criticism and ridicule of people who believe that there was an intelligence creator behind it, it can become unbelievably powerful in the mind of the reader. But it's all an illusion. And what we need to do as Christian apologists is shatter those illusions. And then we need to present our own arguments and our own evidence and make sure that we do that in a scholarly way, in a way that will be taken seriously, So yeah, I appreciate those comments very much, Josh.
Anything else, Josh, that you'd like to add before we dive into some of these different objections that are offered by atheists?
Probably. Well, I'll save it for later because I don't want to go on a tangent. I think it's probably the right time to go into the more practical adventure here.
Okay, fair enough. Dale, is there anything that you'd like to add before we do that?
No, I'm good to go.
Okay, so what I have done is, what's interesting about Phil's book, and I love it, is that you separate the arguments by chapters and address specific arguments, differing arguments that I found, but the generalized notion in different chapters, and dedicate those chapters to those specific arguments. And so what I've done is go through the book and get my favorite objections, and more so my favorite answers to those objections. And I just want to basically post what the objection is, and then let you guys, we'll start with Phil, obviously, since he's our guest, to how would you respond to these objections specifically? And then we'll go around to Dale. Josh, if you want to jump in on this as well, and then I can offer some thoughts as well. And the first one I have here, and these are just going to be simple one-liners here, and I'm not going to go in order in the way that I have listed them. I apologize, but given the route this conversation's going, I think this would be a good starter. And so the first objection that I have is, we've all had our conversations with atheists before. Matter of fact, here on Faith Unaltered, we had a conversation that got a little heated with an atheist a while back. And this was the claim that he was making. And so the first, and before I get into this real quick, just to our audience, yes, Phil, you're up for taking audience questions, correct? Okay. I thought you would be. We are going to take audience questions. I've already...
Phil was telling me before the show that he was very disappointed that we only went 4 hours last time. So this one has to be 5.
You're going to be really disappointed this time. Dale, you and Phil can go 5 hours. I'm hopping off at 2. But I love
that's
you guys.
Said last time.
That is what I said last time. And we broke the record. Yep. And by the way, that was the record for the longest Faith Unaltered episode ever. I think that was the longest episode on David's channel ever, including Pora, CSG, and Faith Unaltered. So that was a marathon. But for our audience, yes, we will be taking audience questions. As always, and I encourage people, super chats get priority. We had a meeting today with the host, and our financials are starting to dwindle a little bit. We're starting to use some of those resources, and we're not we're putting into it, obviously, but from our audience members, they're starting to go down a little bit. So if you would like to financially support our ministry so we can keep doing things like this, advertising is the big thing that we are focusing those funds on right now to get more people. If y'all haven't noticed, we're getting very close to 3,000 subscribers. And that's because of you all. We're taking the money that you all send us in Super Chats, Cash App, Venmo, and putting that toward advertising. And so it took 7 months last time to get to 1,000 subscribers. We're already 600 in, and we just did our 2,000 subscriber party. When was that? December? November, wasn't it, Josh?
It was the beginning of November. It was like November 4th.
November 3rd or 4th. Yeah. So, and we're all, so halfway, or half the time it took us to get 1,000, we're already at 600. And so
since I shaved me head.
There you go. And there's
it's not that long yet.
It's not. It's getting there though. It's getting there. That grew back
I'll
fast.
have to shave it
bro.
again.
It did. You will at 3,000, but
Do it.
we're almost there.
No,
and
that's the beard at 3,000, I believe, was the promise. That was
No.
the promise.
that's
No way.
5,000, Dale. That's 5,000.
Okay.
So
If we
get
hit
to 5,000 by the end of the
tomorrow.
year. By tomorrow, he said. But anyway, so that I say all that to say thank you to our audience, because without you, I don't think we would be where we are right now. So that is that. So super chats will take priority, and then we will get to the other questions as we can. So not going to promise to get to all of them, but we will get to what we can. So okay, without further ado, the first objection is God is not necessary for morality to exist. Now, I personally have heard this a few different times, and recently here on the show, this objection has come up. But Phil, I just want to turn it over to you. If you're in a conversation with an atheist, with an agnostic, or term I like to use, skeptic, right? And this comes up, God is not necessary for morality to exist. How would you respond?
Yeah, well, I would respond by doing two things. The first thing would be to point out the fallacies. And then I would present them for their consideration with the moral argument for the existence of God. So we would do one thing that strips down the fallacies, and then we would do something else that would build up the argument, and then ask them for their consideration. Would you consider this argument, and do you have any answers, to that? And by the way, I want to thank BJ for saying that I'm looking more LaVey this interview than ever before, and so that's that's a huge compliment. I appreciate that, BJ. So
you get that everywhere, don't you?
Yeah, all the time. I told you the story, right?
Uh-huh.
The
Yep.
Olive Garden story. Yeah.
Yep.
So, all right. So the first thing that I would point out is that this commits two fallacies, at least two fallacies. There's actually a multitude of fallacies involved here. The one is the straw man fallacy, and the other one is the category mistake. But these, and for those of you who may not be familiar with the straw man fallacy, it's the fallacy where you build a straw man out of your opponent's narratives and arguments, and then you attack the caricature that you've made of that argument instead of attack the argument that they really made. And the way that this is a straw man is that we never said God is necessary for morality to exist. We said that God is necessary for morality to be objective, and for morality to be binding on all human beings. And obviously, we don't need God for people to be moral. And the atheists are telling us all the time, don't tell me I need God to be moral, because if I need God to be moral, then I'm not a moral person. And we would obviously acknowledge in all charity that, yes, atheist, my atheist friend, you are a moral person. And I admire your commitment to high moral principles. So when you can assure them that you're respecting their moral framework and their moral status, well, maybe not moral status, but their commitment to morality, then you've earned some points there where you can listen. But they're attacking a straw man. We never said that God is necessary for morality to exist. We said God is necessary for morality to be objective and to be binding on all human beings. And so our argument is no God, no obligation to be moral. And you have just as much or no moral authority as I do. And whose morality are we going to obey? Yours or mine? Because everybody has their own preferences and everybody has their own moral framework. And if there's no God and no moral standard that transcends human beings, then we're all making it up on our own, basically. And so the other thing is that they will bring up, well, the reason that we should be moral is because that will preserve the human race, we can't survive if there's moral chaos. And the prosperity and well-being of society is at stake here. So that's why we should all be moral. And my answer to that is, why? Why should any individual care about the preservation of the human race?
Mm-hmm.
What is so special about the human race that it should be preserved and that it should survive? If there's no God that we answer to, why should we care about anything other than our own survival, our own prosperity, our own well-being? And the answer is there's no reason. No atheist can give us any kind of objective reason that's grounded in an objective argument or objective reality as to why we shouldn't just care about our own survival and not the rest of the human race. To heck with the rest of the human race.
I mean,
I don't care about them.
Isn't that the way? And correct me if I'm wrong. Maybe I'm totally wrong on this, but isn't that the way the animal world works for the most part? I'm sure there's exceptions, right, to where animals care for other beings other than themselves. They sacrifice themselves, but the majority I'm talking about isn't me only. Like, I care about my survival, and that's it.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what makes us any different? Yeah.
Under atheism, there's no such thing as human beings being created in the image of God, because there is no God. They weren't created. So therefore, we are on the same moral level as the animals. And if that's the case, there's no reason for us to behave any differently than the animals.
Yep.
I wrote an article.
More evolved. That's it. That's the only difference between us and a spider, is that we're a little bit more involved. Supposedly,
there are a lot of people that think that dogs and horses are more evolved than human beings are, because at least dogs are faithful and loyal, you know. But then you have to ask, why are dogs faithful and loyal? You know, what is it? You know, is that a good thing? Is that better than not being faithful and loyal? You know, but if there's no God, in humanity has no objective value, and therefore the death of humanity doesn't matter. And so the argument that we should be moral in order to preserve humanity and preserve our well-being and prosperity and be able to procreate and keep the human being, you know, keep the human race going. Why should we keep the human race going? And what you'll normally get when you ask that question is you'll get a personal answer to that question. Well, I just can't believe that anybody would not want the human race to survive and prosper.
Oh, there are some. There are some that think we are a virus.
That's
and
right.
That to protect the earth, we must eliminate ourselves.
That's right. And the question to the atheist is, why should we follow our preferences and what we think is a good agenda for the survival of humanity? Why should we follow that agenda? And why does the person who doesn't want more humanity to survive, why can't they get what they want?
Right.
So, but also, if there's no God, then we are biological machines with no free will, as Sam Harris pointed out, and as Stephen Hawking pointed out. If that's the case, then we would have no reason to invent something like morality. Machines that just appeared out of nowhere for no reason, out of the soup of biology, they have no reason to invent something, to invent the abstract concept of morality. And not only that, but we would be determined by natural causes to believe in things like morality and to behave the way that we do, moral or not. Mm-hmm. If that's the case, then you can't criticize somebody for doing what natural law has determined them to do, and they cannot do otherwise. So determinism is a direct result of atheism. Atheism induces determinism, and determinism renders morality meaningless, because everybody's simply doing what they're determined to do by natural law. How can you call that right or wrong? What basis are you going to invoke in order to differentiate between something that is supposedly immoral as opposed to something that's supposedly moral? You know,
right? So, it'd be more like agreeable or disagreeable rather than right or wrong.
Right. It's my preference. It's no different than the preference between chocolate and vanilla. It's just somebody's preference. This is what they like. And to say this is evil and immoral because I don't like it, a person who says that is ripe for being institutionalized, for mental instability, because if I go around saying, hey, I don't like black licorice, therefore black licorice is evil and immoral, and nobody should eat black licorice, nobody's going to take me seriously, and rightly so. And then I would proceed to presenting the moral argument for the existence of God. We all have a moral compass built into us. How do you explain that? And on atheistic evolutionary terms, that cannot be explained. So,
Dale, over to you.
Yeah. So I agree in large with a lot of what Phil was saying, and sorry. In fact, I remember even having a discussion on back in my skeptics and seekers days with an atheist, hardcore materialist, and that sort of thing on this issue where. I gave him this hypothetical, like, hey, pretend I'm Donald Trump. I've got my hand ready to press the button to launch the nukes and end the human race. And he's, like, stop me, say something to stop me. Well, that's against human flourishing. And that's a fact. I can prove that if you launch the nukes, all the humans will die. Like, yeah, why shouldn't I do that? I want to do that. Stop me. What can you say? And he admitted what Phil was saying. He's got nothing. There's nothing he can say to make me value human flourishing and that sort of thing as an atheist. So I agree with a lot of what Phil was saying. I guess one difference that I would have, Tyler was asking what difference is. I am happy to actually take this questioner's this questioner's thing at face value, where he's saying, look, what was it he said? Why is God necessary for morality to exist? That's how I would argue, because I don't necessarily, in my moral argument, argue for objective morality. I think that's a valid approach, but I actually like to argue for necessary morality, necessary moral truths. So moral truths are logically necessary. They're true in every single logically possible world. Same with the higher moral principles, which correspond to values, right? We value the principle of life, the moral principle of life preservation, the moral principle of truth, the moral principle of justice. These are corresponding to values within God's nature. God, by nature, values these things, and that what constitutes good versus evil and that sort of thing, right? And I think those are true in every logically possible world as well. God has the same values in every logically possible world. So I would be happy to argue for necessary morality rather than just objective morality. So in that sense, yeah, in order for values to exist, you need a moral agent, a personal God who grounds those values. He values this or that. And also those truths are grounded in God's omniscience, right? There are true propositions that are part of God's mind. So maybe that's a slight difference I would have with Phil's approach.
Right on. Thank you for that, Dale. And thank you, GU, for the $5 super chat made by Jim Bob. Makes these arguments very well, often on Atheist TikTok. Try to schedule a show with him. That would be fun, I think. That would be interesting to do that. So thank you so much, GU, for your $5 super chat. That really helps us out. And Brandon coming in with a $10 super chat. Hey, brothers, thanks so much for what you guys do. I just made it to my in-laws in Ohio from Chicago, so I can't watch the rest. I will rewatch later. Viewers, like, comment, and share. So thank you, Brandon, for that. And I agree with Brandon, so enjoy. Glad you made it safe to Ohio. That's right next door to me in Indiana. So I would be interested to see how close you actually are. But I agree with him. Viewers, like, comment, and share. And if you want to send a super chat, the way you can do that is underneath the video. You will see a little, if you're watching on YouTube, we're also streaming to Twitter or X now. But if you're on YouTube and you see the little $sign underneath, you can click that and you'll get three options. I think three options: a super chat, a super sticker, or a super thanks. And depending on what you want to do, send us a sticker, or this is a super chat. you can type in a little message here, and you notice how GU's is a little bit shorter than Brandon's here. So the reason Brandon got more character space is because he made a larger donation. And so that's the way YouTube chats work. Our super chats work. We have nothing to do with that. That's all a YouTube thing. But the more that you donate, the more you can type. So if you have a super long question, that's what you would need to do for that, or try to summarize it. But I just wanted to give a shout out to both of those guys and say thank you for the super chat. Dale, were you finished and we want to move on to Josh, or did you have some more to say on that? I didn't mean to interrupt you if I did.
No, yeah, no, I think I was finished giving my point there. So yeah, over to Josh.
Yep.
Great
Josh.
points, Dale.
Yeah. Very
thanks.
good.
Well, I mean, to be honest, there's not a whole lot to add. I think you guys pretty much got, as it's a very surface level statement. The only thing I would say is almost every time I've encountered this kind of objection, it's really just almost the way that Dale was pointing out, that the same way to point out a fallacy is to end the conversation. I feel like this is one of those like half-hearted attempts to say, well, I don't think I'm just going to put up this blockade, and I don't think you have anything to knock it over. You don't have a crowbar big enough to flip this thing, right? It's like, usually when that's actually being said, what's really being entailed due to the context of in the conversations I've had, I'm speaking personally, when I've encountered this objection, it's usually actually meant to say, I can be a good person without needing a theology to guide my metaphysics because I make good decisions, right? Which is, as Phil pointed out, actually at odds directly with the idea of the naturalistic worldview. Oftentimes there's this same pushback. It's not a worldview. It's a statement about this or that, and it's a philosophical statement. It's like, okay, well, it's nested in how your worldview is as a whole, right? It has its place, and because of its place, it's going to inform everything else. That's what these metaphysical claims do. That's why they're important to point out. That's why it's important to consider this, is that you're actually making a statement that you think it's not necessary, right? You're assuming a couple of things, that morality can exist. You know what I mean? Like, in order to get there, you can simply ask this person something like, go on, what do you mean? You know what I mean? That's going to give you at least a good gauge, practically speaking, how far into this objection this person is actually nested. Is this coming from the sap of it, or is this just a surface level dismissal, right? And so you kind of ask them. This is another one of those times where listening is going to be really helpful. Ask the person to explain why they think that's true. And don't just assume that you need to answer it first. Even if you have an answer, ask them to explain themselves, because again, you can be hacking away at the wrong branches. Perhaps this person has a more clear idea about what they're talking about than you think, and there's a lot less to dissect than you would consider, because maybe they've gone relatively deeply down this rabbit hole, or maybe they haven't, they just kept it as a surface level of some sort. And then as you ask that question, you're going to reveal to them that they actually have a question mark where an answer should be. And perhaps now they'll be willing to listen to you, because instead of asserting yourself on top of them, you've given them room to conclude that they need to ask a question rather than give an assertion like this, right? So that's one of those times where being relational or relatable to this person in a conversation is going to be really helpful. Unfortunately, this is not all that easy when you're using online forums in a comment section. A lot of what we're talking about here is probably more helpful in an actual conversation, or let's say a phone call or a live chat like this, where you can see and respond to the person rather than just to the words or the concepts. I think that's probably going to guide the process I'm talking about a little bit easier and more smoothly. But I think that's probably what I would say is, if this person hasn't gone far enough down this rabbit hole to see why that objection doesn't land anywhere, for a theist that knows what they're talking about, right? Like if you know what you're talking about, the way that Phil or Dale are actually articulating so far, if you're going to take this problem apart that far, it's probably, you don't even have to go that far. You might actually be able to poke at something more particular if you ask the person first to articulate why they would even think that that's a defensible position. But I think the only thing that would be, also relevant to note is that this really is usually in relation to, I have a conscience, I don't need a God, is basically how this can be condensed. I have a conscience, I don't need a God. All you have to do to point out to this person is your conscience is fallible like you, it develops over time. So you're developing towards something that you think would be better. That would be progress. You're doing that in relation to something. You know what I mean? Like whatever you've plugged in the hole that we call God, you got something there. Just point it out to him,
Right. Yeah. And I actually mentioned in the book that the whole idea of moral progress assumes that there is some kind of moral standard that you're getting closer to as you make that progress. But that's extremely valuable. And it's frustrating to me that usually when I'm interacting with these objections from atheists, I'm usually interacting with the literature and not interacting with somebody personally. That can be a little bit of a disadvantage. It's hard to be relational when you're writing a book that's in response to somebody else that wrote something else in a book. But that's why this interaction with Stephen Jay Gould and with Lawrence Krauss has been so valuable, because I was able to actually interact with them. The problem with that context was that I couldn't have a conversation with Stephen Jay Gould. I simply asked a question and he simply answered it. I wish that I could have engaged with him, but I couldn't. It was in an auditorium full of 5,000 people, or however many there were. And the interaction with Lawrence Krauss was also very limited because it was in a book club session, and I was not the only person asking questions and not the only person interacting. So I had extremely limited amount of time, and man, I wish we could just sit down over coffee, and just have a conversation, because that's where, these relational approaches can be so much more meaningful, and that's where they're possible, where they're not possible when you're just interacting with literature.
And to be honest, the relational approach I'm talking about is a lot more impactful than simple argumentation a lot of the time. Even
Right.
to people who are, let's say, like, very staunchly logical people, and they think, and they're very academic or whatever. Oftentimes, even those people are a lot more impacted by somebody who is taking the time to make sure that they know that you're taking them seriously. They're 10 times more willing to listen to you because you're actually taking them seriously. Like, I think that's one of the reasons why Tyler and I are so drawn to one another, even though early on we had a lot of disagreement. Like, I'm sure we still have now. I just don't know what they are. but like, there's a lot less disagreement now, only because both of us were willing that entire time to take each other very seriously, give each other enough slack, but not so much as to be completely ineffective. We were always trying to find, where is the thing we're actually pointing to here when I say you're wrong, I'm right, or I'm right and you're wrong, whatever this is, however that's arranged. I'm actually pointing to something here. I need to take you seriously enough and me seriously enough to find out exactly what that is, or we'll never go anywhere. Like you were saying, answering again, right? And it's like, the reason why we're coming back to it, I think, is because Christians aren't taking atheists seriously, and atheists definitely aren't taking Christians seriously. And I think if we actually took the time to think, this person that you're talking to is a person and not just a thing on a screen or some words, you know what I mean? And take into account the personhood of that's what makes it real. I think that's really what makes it real. And I think that's why internet trolls are so prominent, is because it just doesn't seem real anymore. It's also synthetic.
And on the personal side, there's also another consideration that is often, not always, but often lurking in the shadows with the atheist. It's when they say, I don't need God to be moral, sometimes that comes out of, I've just interacted with somebody who does believe in God, and they are very immoral. They do bad things, and they believe in this God, and they supposedly draw their moral compass from this God they believe in, and yet they behave badly. And so I don't need God. I don't need this God to inspire me, because I have no reason to believe that he's going to make me act any better than somebody who doesn't believe in God.
Mm-hmm.
And so there is that personal dimension, and I've actually encountered that personal dimension, from time to time. The purpose of this book is not to interact with the atheist. The purpose of this book is to interact with the Christian who I am trying to save from the fallacies and the attacks of the atheists. And I have a hard time being charitable in the following sense, Josh. It's hard for me to be charitable towards someone who is viciously attacking my brothers and sisters in Christ.
Yeah.
It's not impossible, but I tell you what, I have a hard time with it. My heart is with the Christian who's being attacked more than it is with the atheist who's attacking them. That's just a reality for me personally. And if there are ways that you can suggest that I can try to mitigate that a little bit, I'd be happy to hear it. And so,
There's one thing I'll just add, because Tyler, you put up a comment for this question, like kind of this age-old objection from atheists to Christians, and the atheists are actually right there. Are you saying that I can't act good if I'm an atheist? In other words, is belief in God necessary for me to act morally in a given situation and stuff? And the obvious answer is no. I mean, some atheists can act good and that sort of thing. However, one thing I will add is there are some moral actions that atheists by definition can't do. For example, worshiping God. That is a morally good action that atheists can't do because they don't believe in God in the first place. And that, so I just wanted to add in that's something that's interesting. That yeah, it's true that atheists can do some moral actions, but they can't do all the moral actions. Maybe, yeah.
Yeah, good points, y'all. Good points. And I don't want to add to anything that y'all already said because I'll just be repeating myself at this point. But the thing I want to emphasize is something that each and every one of these guys hit on, is to go out and actually engage with people, right? If you're, don't get me wrong, there is a time and a place, just like what we're doing now, to engage on social media platforms. But I think the bigger impact that could be made, right, is outside the realm of the internet world, right, and in your local communities. If somebody's struggling with some of these thoughts in your church, then that's the place to be. I think that relationships can be developed, because I'm telling you right now, Josh made an excellent point a minute ago about him and my relationship with him. We wouldn't be as close as we are if we simply engaged each other on the internet. I mean, we wouldn't. So there is so much potential there for developing relationships, developing social skills. I realized early on that my social skills, like out in the world, actually declined being on the internet and engaging with people on the internet more than I was out in the world. I didn't know how to respond to people on the internet. You can stop, think about what you're going to say. If you're on a
Backspace.
keyboard, you can backspace. Exactly. You can't backspace in reality, man. You can't backspace if you're actually having a conversation with someone. And even like we are now, I mean, I think this is more helpful, like on Zoom or StreamYard, than just sitting behind a keyboard and typing. So what we're saying is we're encouraging all of you watching, either now or later on down the road, to be active, be involved in your communities, your local communities. This is why God has put you there, so you can impact that little section in your neck of the woods. So, all right, y'all, let's go ahead and move on. I've got 3 more objections, and this one, I want to bring it up. This is the title of the book, Machines Don't Laugh, and so I want to address free will then at this point. So the next objection is this. The atheist says, or the skeptic, Humans do not have free will. Rather, our actions are necessitated or determined by natural antecedents. So, Phil, over to you.
Well, I would point out that if humans have no free will, humans have no knowledge.
Mhm.
And I have a chapter in both Machines Don't Laugh and in Calvin's Desperation that discuss how determinism destroys knowledge.
Can I stop you real quick? I
Yes.
don't mean to interrupt. I don't mean to throw you off. What you're about to say, can this be applied to Calvinists as well?
Yes.
Okay. Go ahead.
Yes. The fundamental principle here is that if we have no free will, then everything that we think and believe and judge in our minds or in our brains, if atheist is the context, atheism is the context, is determined by something other than ourselves. Let me say that again. If we have no free will, then everything that we think and believe and judge, every time we think we're reasoning, all of those things are being determined by something or someone else other than ourselves. If that's the case, we have no way of knowing whether or not the ideas or beliefs that we have in our head that are being determined are true or false. The reason we believe them is not because they're true or false. The reason we believe them is because something else determined that we would believe them. Something else forced us to believe them. Now, in the case of atheism, then every thought that we have in our heads is determined by natural law, the laws of physics and chemistry, all the laws that are occurring in our brain, all the chemical reactions that are happening in our brains. Those are what determine what we think and believe. What we think and believe is not the result of thinking and choosing to accept a conclusion based on evidence. That would require free will. If we have no free will, then that is completely eliminated from the equation. So everything that we believe is determined by something else. In the case of atheism, it's determined by natural law. And if that's the case, we have no way of knowing whether or not natural law is causing us to believe what is true or is causing us to believe something just because that's what natural law does. So whenever somebody like Stephen Hawking comes along and says, if all of these scientific principles that I'm teaching you in this book right now are true, then we are nothing more than biological machines, and we have to admit to ourselves, which is ironic, because he's acting as though this is the result of some kind of rational deliberation, right? But he's basically saying we have to admit to ourselves that we're simply biological machines, and free will is an illusion. And one of the things that I point out in the book is machines can't have illusions. How can a machine have an illusion? What is an illusion to a machine? How can you cause a machine to be deceived into believing something that is an illusion to it? There's no such thing as an illusion for a machine. So, but all of those beliefs, all of those thoughts are all determined by antecedent conditions. And if that's the case, then we have no idea whether they're true or false. And what happens is that the atheists will typically contain the discussion in terms of the laws of nature, the way that they exist out in the world. They typically neglect the fact that this must include the laws, the natural laws that are operating inside our heads. And often I've talked to atheists who believe that everything is determined, that we have no free will, and they're surprised to learn or to realize that this must include every thought that they have in their head as well. When they begin to think in those terms, suddenly they start to doubt whether or not this is something that's coherent, something that's worthy of their credence. So that's why I've also said that determinism destroys morality, because if we have no free will, morality is completely out the window. But you just got through saying that you don't need God to be moral. But now you're saying that we have no free will. Well, you need free will to be moral, my friend. If you have no free will, you can't be moral either. So now the question of God is pretty much irrelevant, isn't it? If we have no free will, morality is completely out the window. And so when before you told me that you could be moral without God, now you're telling me that you can't be moral because you have no free will. So there's this huge disconnect there, in these ideas. And again, we if you're in discussion with an atheist, you point them out gently. You say, well, have you thought about this? Let me just throw something out for you to consider and tell me what you think about this. Because when you ask somebody what they think about something, you're giving them respect, and you're inspiring them to actually have a dialogue with you, and you're not shutting things down with fallacies being used as a weapon. But when you're dealing with Christians who are being attacked by atheists, Christians need to understand the implications of determinism and the lack of free will. And many times Christians are not aware of those implications. And so it's important that we point them out.
You're muted, Tyler.
Thank you. And so I should say before we get into this, so I asked Phil earlier if the same things that he's about to say can be applied to Calvinists. Now, granted, Calvinists believe, or they say they do, believe in free will, right? So what I should have said, the way I should have phrased this question, humans do not have libertarian free will, rather our actions are necessitated or determined by natural antecedents. So no one's trying to commit fallacies that we just talked about earlier by straw manning the position, right? We know that Calvinists will say that we believe we have free will.
But would that make a difference? Because I think that the majority of, at least like new atheists and stuff, they're just hardcore determinists. Like Richard Dawkins, they don't go for a compatibilist view. So I don't think it mattered. Yeah, they just deny it, right?
Right, with the atheists, I think that that's absolutely true. But since I brought up Calvinists as well, I wanted to definitely nuance that a little bit. And also, so I want to go to the comments real quick, because what
is it okay? Sorry to interrupt. Ty, is it okay? Let me just ask you, since you're the host. I had something to say about the free will thing that I think might be helpful. Just very quickly.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we're going to stick on the subject of free will whenever I go to the comment section, but yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So I had three things to say as a response to this, but I'll just raise this one thing. And it was really helpful when I was at my first job. I remember when I was talking to these atheists, one of the atheists, girl named Crystal, raised this objection to me specifically, and I just did a simple little experiment, right? So I put a pen on the desk, and I said, "Pick up the pen," right? And okay, she picked it up, and then I put my hand like towards her eyes, and she like blinked and moved away, right? Like I didn't touch her, but like I got close enough where she reacted and blinked her eyes and went away. And I said, "Is there a difference but when you picked up the pen compared to when you just blinked your eyes right now?" And she said, "Well, yeah, obviously there's a clear difference. I chose to pick up the pen," kind of thing, right? So I think that was a great way. That's when I led into, well, what are the various conditions for having libertarian free will? The ability, dual ability condition, the control condition, and stuff like that. It made a lot more sense in light of the fact that she had that contrastive experience between blinking her eyes versus picking up the pen. So that was just a helpful way to engage. But yeah, I'll shut up and over to the comments then.
No, thank you for that, Dale. I appreciate that. And you're right. And so with that being said, I think that kind of ties into what I'm getting ready to pull up. So with this conversation specifically, that we talk about free will, determinism, or I should say libertarian free will, and determinism, whether it's divine determinism, naturalistic determinism, different things like that. So this, what was said in the comments, comes up a lot. And I know I've brought it up with Josh a lot, and I know what his answer is. And so I'm going to spoil it for everybody and give the answer as soon as I read this. But I'm curious, if there's another way that you guys would respond to this objection now, what would that be? But Titan says this, for that matter, if God is omniscient, he knew what you would do, or what you would know, excuse me, and believe before you were born, and you can't go against his omnipowers to do otherwise. So, with that being said, and again, Josh, if you recollect, I've told you this multiple times. And the thing that you told me every single time, and it finally clicked, is that God's knowledge is not causal. You do not have that concept. I can say, and in a very, so whenever I give analogies comparing myself, and this is going to sound weird, but to God, right? Realize that that chasm is infinite. And if I can do something, then it just should be assumed that God is doing something, but can do something as well. But what I mean by that is I know very intimately my dad, right? And I know that my dad is going to wake up in the morning, roughly between 7 and 8 o'clock in the morning, and have his cup of coffee. Now, my knowing that did not cause him to do that, right? And so that's a very simplistic way, I think, that we can say God works in this world. God is active in this world. Nobody's denying that claim. But to see in the way that I know my dad is going to have a cup of coffee, I'm not responsible for my dad having a cup of coffee. That's a free will decision that he's making, though in some way my knowledge is connected to his action of having the cup of coffee in the morning. And I see that if another example, my little girl, if she plays out in the middle of the road, it might not happen tomorrow, it might not happen the next day, but if she continues, she's just increasing the odds of her getting hit by a car. I know that. Will she? Maybe, maybe not. But the point is, if she does, my knowledge didn't have anything to do with that. I knew it would happen. And the thing I hear from determinists at that point is this idea that, well, just because God knows something, right? It is connected. Omniscience is just not the answer to that. And I'm sitting here like, why? Why does it have to be? And we heard it on the Chris Date. I love Chris Date, don't get me wrong, but we heard on the Chris Date and Tim Stratton debate that omniscience just cannot be the answer to that. Why? That was never addressed. But omniscience just can't be the answer. And I'm just like, but omniscience is the answer. We have an omniscient God. That is the answer to that question. It doesn't have to go any further than that. So that would be the way I would address this claim. But Phil, over to you. How would you deal with that?
Well, I would gently point out that there is a very subtle equivocation going on here. And this is kind of another way of saying what you just said, but I want to point to the actual terminology that's used here, because the terminology starts out with the word omniscient, but then there's a shift in the terminology to omnipowers. And so what's happening is omnipowers and omniscient are being conflated here.
Yep.
As soon as you say God is omniscient, you can't then turn around and then translate that into omnipotence, because that's what omnipowers is. So you can't go against God's omnipotence, but that's an equivocation. That is not the issue here. The issue is, can you go against God's omniscience? And if God knows what will happen, then he knows what will happen because he knows all things, and because he's outside of time. He's not a time-bound being. Therefore, he sees all of time at once in kind of an eternal present, so to speak. But that doesn't mean that the fact that he knows something is going to happen means that his power is what caused it to happen. And it's very, very subtle, and it's something that we have a responsibility to point out. It's no criticism toward the person who made the comment, but I would definitely need to expose that equivocation, and that conflation. So Frank Turek gives a great analogy when it comes to this. He said, suppose I wanted to watch a football game and I couldn't watch it at the time, so I taped it. I put it on TiVo, or I did I recorded the football game so that I could watch it later. But just before I started watching the game, somebody on social media came up and said, "Oh man, isn't it a bummer that the Broncos lost the game?" Well, that spoils the whole thing. But Frank says, suppose I decided that I wanted to go ahead and see how they won, and I wanted to go ahead and watch it anyway. So when I watch that video, I know how the game is going to turn out. Does that mean that that knowledge means that I caused how that game turned out? No, it doesn't. It just means that I knew how the game was going to turn out. And so, and this is another fallacy that I have to point out. This is my job here, pointing out fallacies, and that's the fallacy of begging the question, because it's question begging, and begging the question is assuming what you're attempting to prove, and it's question begging to say that God's knowledge is causal, like you said, Tyler. I have never heard an argument even presented that God's knowledge is causal, let alone actually being successful. So that's how I would respond. And that's just kind of the business that we have to be in. We have to be very careful. We have to carefully examine everything, and we have to discover what problems may exist in what we're examining, and then we have to be able to expose them, and we should do it gently and charitably. So.
Well, and to that point, Phil, Dell and I just had an interesting interview with Dr. David Bradshaw, who's an Orthodox Christian that takes a very Orthodox specific approach in discussing God, and namely the essence and energies distinction. And we got onto this subject a little bit, that the divine determinism is explicitly linked to Augustine's view of divine simplicity, because Augustine equivocated the actions of God to his essence. And yeah, exactly. Because those things were equivocated, that's how divine determinism came to be, right? And so if anybody wants more info on that, I'm still new to this argument. It's the second time I've heard it, so I cannot explain it very well, but go back and watch it's on both the Eastern Orthodox playlist as well as the free will and divine determinism, our theological determinism playlist. Or if you go to our channel, go to the live tab, scroll down. It's like we just did the interview on Wednesday, so it should be right there at the top. But Dr. Bradshaw points that out. And just to add to the conversation, I would say personally that omniscience, because we can, in a sense, know God by his omniscience, he manifests that to us. That would be an energy of God, according to Dr. David Bradshaw. However, what's not linked, or what needs to be argued from the determinist perspective, is one, that their view of divine simplicity is the correct one, and that even though both are an energy, God's providence, his action in time and space, and his omniscience, right, is linked. Those two things are linked. And that's what, Phil, you just said, that an argument has not been shown for that. So even if they're both energies, that's fine. Show me how they are mechanistically linked to cause all that happens within space-time. So right. Waiting for that argument, and I've invited a couple guys in the chat to come on, and during our open mic session, if they disagree with us at this point, to argue for their side. So we'll see how that turns out. But anyway,
I just wanted to very quickly comment on the Calvinism issue that you brought up, because it's true that the Calvinists will say, I believe in free will. And they will say, don't tell me I don't believe in free will just because I'm a determinist. And there's an interesting book out there called Deviant Calvinism, and I can't remember the name of the guy that wrote it, but he said that if Jones affirms X and X implies Y, then Jones affirms Y whether he realizes it or not. Mm-hmm. And so that's what I would say to the Calvinist, and that's what also I would say to the atheist, who is also a materialistic determinist. I would say to the Calvinist, you may affirm and assert that you believe in free will, but if you're a determinist, then the kind of free will that you believe in is not really free. And to call it free will is really, kind of it's a little bit of a lazy option, to be real honest. And maybe I shouldn't say lazy, because that can be emotionally charged. But Calvin himself said that yes, we can affirm some sort of free will, but then he said, if it can be so dignified by such a title.
Right.
And his implication was that it can't be dignified by such a lofty title. That it's really not free will that's anything worth having, as Tim Stratton would say. And it's not the kind of free will that is truly free. It is simply the freedom to act upon your nature. But the problem is that your nature is also being determined, and therefore to call it free will is really misleading. But I have actually encountered atheists who say, I believe in materialistic determinism. Everything is determined by natural law, by the laws of physics and chemistry. But I reject the idea that we have no free will. We do have free will. And so there are compatibilist atheists out there, believe it or not. And I would say the same thing to them that I would say to the Calvinist who says, I believe in free will. That if you're determinist, then everything is determined, whether you want to affirm some flavor of free will or not. Everything is still determined. And the only way that could not be true is for you to retreat from determinism. And if that's the case, then everything falls apart, because you've departed from the whole framework to begin with. So and you're no longer a compatibilist because you're no longer a determinist.
Yeah.
So it's not beneficial for you to be a compatibilist if you don't believe in divine determinism or materialistic determinism, whatever it happens to be. If you're determinist, everything is still determined, period. And you have to face the implications of that. So whether it's libertarian free will or some compatibilist free will, that's an important distinction. And we always need to make sure that we are talking about libertarian free will, but that's the only free will that matters at the end of the day.
Right. I just saw this comment. If I had to pick one argument that shows that God of the Bible isn't real, it would be that he's supposed to be all loving, but he likes to murder children. That's incongruent. And I would just say to that, we addressed that, 15, 20 minutes ago, spent about an hour, about a half hour on it. So I would encourage UDEF to go back, rewind about half hour, and we start addressing that there. But the author of the book that you were talking about, Deviant Calvinism, is Oliver Crisp.
Crisp, that's right.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. I didn't know that. I just looked it up. So Google, thank you.
Well, I quote him in Calvin's Desperation.
Yeah.
And so there's no excuse for me to forget his name. But,
yeah. Right. Yeah, do that, UDEF. I'd be interested to see what you have to say about that. But over to you, Del. Go ahead.
And real quick though, yeah. I'm sorry to just real quickly. The phrase "God murders children" is incoherent, because only human beings can murder other human beings. If God wants to take the life of a human being, he has that right, because he's the author of life. So it's not murder if God decides to take the life of a human being, even if it's a baby. So just wanted to stick that in there real quick.
Thank you for that. Go ahead, Dale.
Yeah, so I just wanted to say something about the other comment that you had up about omniscience not being not causing our choices or anything like that. I would just caution and remind you though there are different types of causation. So I think we should say that because God's omniscience does cause him to make a certain choice and to create this universe and that sort of thing. So it does stand in a causal chain, I would say, but it's not causally, it's not a determinative causation. It's maybe a partial cause at best. And ultimately it's our wills that, you know, it's us as an agent that makes that choice using our will in light of whatever circumstances we're in or that sort of thing. So yeah, I think it would make sense to say it plays a partial causal role, his omniscience, in terms of him choosing which world to create and that sort of thing, based on his, you know, his middle knowledge of what free creatures would do. But ultimately, it is us that determines. None of that determines what we choose to do in any given moment. It is us using our wills to choose that does that. So it's causal, but just not causally determining, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
What
Thank you for that,
would
Dale.
you say that makes sense, Phil, or you're a bit...
Well, I have a little bit of a counterpoint to it.
Sure.
I don't take that position. I don't believe that God's knowledge is causal at all in any way at all. I don't think it plays any kind of causal role. But that's a distinctive, you know. I don't know that I could, if I were to debate somebody on that issue, I'm not sure I would win the debate, you know. So that's just my position at this point, you know, is that God's knowledge does not play any kind of causal role, that only his omnipotence can be causal. And as non-determinists, we affirm that God does determine some things. It's just that the way that he determines some things is through his power and will, but not through his knowledge. That's my personal position on the matter. And so we have a little bit of a variance there between the two of us. But I respect the other one because, like I said, if I was in a rigorous debate about this, I'm not sure I would do very well. So,
Okay, no, that's cool. Yeah, I wanted your take on that because, yeah, I guess I would kind of say, like, yeah, in light of his middle knowledge, we're both Molinists, so in light of his middle knowledge, he uses that knowledge, and that kind of causes him to make that choice as to which world he sets up. But yeah, I respect that you disagree. So yeah, thank you for giving your thoughts.
and
Uh,
just to be clear, I am not a Molinist to that extent. I am what Tim Stratton calls a mere Molinist, and that is that I believe that God has middle knowledge and that man has libertarian freedom. What he does with that middle knowledge, there's a whole range of ideologies about what God does with his middle knowledge, and I don't necessarily subscribe to all those ideas among the more advanced Molinists, you know, that I know of. Yeah, so.
Yeah, and I'm on your side on that front. I see what you're saying. Yeah, because God's a free will agent as well, so it is ultimately it's not like his knowledge causally determines him to create versus not create. So yeah, I'm fully on your side. Yeah, cool. Thanks.
Before we turn it over to Josh, I just wanted to announce also and re-announce it, I guess. We are taking audience questions. If you can't tell, we've been engaging with some in the chat. But if you have a specific question for Phil, for Josh, for Dale, for myself, go ahead and put that in the comment section. Again, super chats always take priority because we feel if you have the decency to donate and help our ministry out, then you will take priority over somebody that doesn't elect to do that. So that's our little thank you for financially supporting us. I just have a clarifying question for someone in the audience. Unless I missed something, I went back and looked through the comments, and then after looking up these verses, I'm not sure exactly what they have to do with what we're talking about right now. But Cody asks, can we have Matthew 10:23, 16:28, and Mark 13:24 through 31 answered, please? Cody, if you can elaborate on that a little bit. I looked up some passages and let's see. I dropped my phone. Sorry. For example, Matthew 16, 28 says, truly I say to you, there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. So, not sure what that has to do with our conversation right now, but if you can elaborate on that, and if it's relevant, we will be more than happy to answer that question. So, with that being said, Josh, is there anything that you would like to address whenever it comes to, which I'm sure you do, humans do not have free will? And I thought I changed that. Hold on. There we go. I had changed this and while we were all talking. Humans do not have libertarian free will. Rather, our actions are necessitated or determined by natural antecedents.
Well, okay. As a preface, I would say if anybody wants to go further than we've already gone, and you're a glutton for that kind of punishment, we do have a very extensive playlist on exactly this topic. It is rather daunting to look at now. It's accumulated well over, if you were watching for probably, almost 2 days straight, you might be able to finish the playlist if you did not stop for almost 2 days straight.
I think we have like 30 hours.
Yeah.
At least 30 hours of content on this subject.
So as far as what we've already said, the only thing that I think probably could be clarified a little bit more is I think the real bother, the real distinction that needs to be made is God knowing what I freely do is not the same as God deciding what I will do of necessity, right? That is really the distinction in terms of what we mean by, God's knowledge is not causal in that way. What we really mean is God can know what I am going to freely do, and that knowledge can be of utility to him, but that knowledge is not of his decision, right? That's what makes it free, is that it was actually my decision. And to Phil's point earlier about the determinists who say, don't tell me that I don't believe in free will, I affirm free will. I think that for those occasions, I've said it before, and I think that it's really useful that if we're going to speak about these things with any level of clarity, using the same terminology and meaning opposite things is probably pretty counterintuitive. So we should just use a different term than free will. If you're a determinist or compatibilist and you affirm the existence of something called a will, and you're going to attach something like moral culpability to it, what I've posited before is something more like an experiential will. You have the experience of being a will and experiencing decisions and experiencing the consequence of decisions and the causal chain of what your reasoning seems to present to you. And you have the conscious experience of being a will, but that doesn't mean that you're a free will. So I posit that an experiential will would be a more accurate and fair description of what they would actually mean by that. But that's kind of a tangent. The other thing that I wanted to address specifically, just for clarity, is up above we have where'd it go? Okay, right here. This I think was misspoke. You don't need free will to be moral. You need free will for morality to be coherent and for moral blameworthiness and praiseworthiness to have any foundation to attach to at all in order for morality to mean anything. And so if you want a meaningful morality in which people are actually blameworthy or praiseworthy for any given action, necessity can't be the thing that guides them into that action. It just doesn't really work. And you can find this argument going back as far as guys like Justin Martyr, right? Like, this is not a new thing. This is a very old argument. Free will is attached to moral culpability, right? And so I think that's why when people say I affirm free will, even though they're a determinist, I think it's the last ditch effort to save moral culpability while maintaining the determinism, which is really the problem, right? And so if moral culpability exists, it has to be attached to something, right? And so for the indeterminist, it's attached to the existence of free will. For the determinist, it's attached to for the naturalistic determinist, I guess it would just be foregone. For the theistic determinist, it would be attached to God's jurisdiction as the arbiter of reality, something like that. And so I think that's really the main distinction that's being got at here. And that's pretty much the only thing that I would really add, is the clarity that I think what's really being said is God knowing what I would freely do and God deciding what I would do out of necessity is just not the same thing.
And I think I think I was the one that said that you need free will to be moral. And in my mind, I could be kind of off the deep end on this, but in my mind, being moral implies making a moral decision. So
Right.
you're making a decision to commit a certain act as opposed to a different act in any given circumstance. Um, and in order to make a moral decision, you have to be able to make a decision. But under determinism, and if God doesn't exist, you have determinism, you don't make decisions at all. So if you can't make a decision, you can't make a moral decision. And that's kind of what I mean when I say without free will, you can't be moral. And I think
Well,
that's
that's
where
ultimately what I meant by pointing out that the question is what makes the decision moral, even if you want to colloquially call what determinism says you're experiencing is a decision. What makes it a moral decision is that it's attached to blameworthiness or praiseworthiness. And that's what's lacking in determinism for me.
One last thing on this thing. Another point. If you're engaging with an atheist and that sort of thing, there's actually some empirical evidence that it doesn't prove that we have libertarian free will, but it's perhaps suggestive. Benjamin Libet did famous experiments supposedly proving that, he detected something in the brain and that correlated with us making this choice. But later on, he actually did subsequent experiments and he discovered this thing called the free want phenomenon. And what was interesting, that caused him to change his mind, saying that, yeah, we do have libertarian free will because we have this dual ability. And the free want corresponded to people choosing to refrain from making that choice kind of thing. And what was interesting in those experiments is they had the awareness that they've made that choice to refrain from doing a chosen action before the free want neural activity went off. So that, again, it's not conclusive or anything like that, but it's interesting, suggestive, empirical evidence that supports what we're saying.
Right on, guys. Right on. All right. So I'm going to call an audible real quick, and I am going to have to leave. Unfortunately, my wife needs my help with some things. And Josh, Dale, since both of you have access to be able to end the stream, are you guys willing and can you stay until the end until you guys wrap up?
Yeah.
I don't know about Dale, but I have to hop pretty soon too because I haven't eaten
Okay.
since like 9 this morning, and my
Okay.
kids are getting restless back there. So
Okay, yeah, let me go ahead then, and this is the last objection that I've got, and again, I wanted to thank Phil, let me got the cart before the horse there. So this is the last objection I got. I will post this, read it, and then I will bounce. But Phil, I appreciate you having. I'm sorry this came up, but I've got to give my wife a hand. But thank you for coming back on, and I want to have you on more often. So anytime you're ready to start a YouTube channel and you want to do whatever you want to, just hit me up and we'll give you a segment and you can do your own thing. So, but I really appreciate you coming on, and I'm sorry that I have to bounce. But thank you for everything. And thank you for the book. I encourage people, get the book, read it. And let us know what you think about it. We love to hear from our audience. Also, if you have a question for the panel, if you have a topic that you would like to discuss or that you would like to hear us discuss, please, we always take recommendations for our content. Email me, faithunaltered. Let me throw it up here real quick. There it is. faithunaltered@gmail.com. I will get that. Now, however, if you have hate mail, then you can send that to David Russell at faithunaltered.com. That will go directly to our HR, and he can deal with that. So
he loves it.
don't send me hate mail. So I'll just forward it to him. So, but no, I'll just play. But again, thank you for our audience. Thank you for those who super chatted. We really appreciate it. Again, that's just going to help us potentially get more subscribers and hopefully, I mean, I've been transparent with our audience from day one. My goal is to be able to quit my job and do this full time. Like I would love nothing more than that. If that's God's will, then I pray that it's done. And I know all of us feel that way here at the channel. David, Josh, Dane, Dale, I'm sure you would love to do that as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
So if we could ever get in that position, but we're completely crowdfunded, and that's where we need y'all. So without y'all, we couldn't do half of what we're doing. So I really appreciate our audience. I love y'all, and just thank you from the bottom of my heart. And I speak for all of Faith Unaltered whenever I say that. And so Phil, again, brother, thank you so much. But here is the last objection, and I think it's a rather easy one to put down. So with that being said, atheism is not a worldview, rather a simple lack of belief in God. And with that, Phil, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you all for watching Faith Unaltered. Good night. God bless. And make sure, real quick, you tune in to our open mic. So there was a couple people asking in the chat, when is our next open mic? Everybody seems to love our open mics, which is great. You get to participate in those discussions. Our next open mic is next Friday, January 12th. Maurice Robinson, that was originally scheduled. He has not gotten back with me yet, and so I didn't want to schedule it a week out. I like to schedule at least 2 weeks out and confirm with everybody at least 2 weeks out. So once I get back from my time off, then I'm hoping to reach out to Maurice Robinson again to be able to discuss Byzantine textual priority. But as for now, we will be doing an open mic January 12th. That's next Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, so 6 p.m. Central. So that being said, good night. God bless. Stay like Christ.
Love you, bro.
Thanks, Tyler.
Well, go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, I actually put this to bed in the first chapter of Machines Don't Laugh. And this is one of the most common things that I hear from atheists, especially atheists online, especially the social media atheists, and so on. And there are several things to be said for this, and I'm very interested in what Dale has to say about it as well. But my argument, I would argue that atheism is a worldview, and that it makes definite truth claims. That atheism is not just a lack of a belief in God. And if I were to show up to a debate with an atheist, and the question for the debate was, does God exist? What if I were to say, oh, I never said that I believed in God. I just lack a belief that God does not exist. Then that's basically the same thing that the atheist is saying when he says, I just lack a belief in God. Well, I just lack a belief that God doesn't exist. So I guess we can all go home now, right? The whole
Right.
discussion is over. Okay. And all my power tools lack a belief in God, every single one of them. I don't own a power tool that believes in God. Are all my power tools atheists? Because on that definition, they must be. And somebody would say, well, now wait a minute, your power tools are not intelligent. They don't have they're not intelligent beings. And my reply to that is that if God doesn't exist, neither are we. Because we talked before about determinism. If God doesn't exist, then everything is determined by the laws of physics and chemistry. And therefore, we have no intelligence because we cannot have anything that we could call knowledge. So if we don't have anything that we can call knowledge, then we have no idea whether we're intelligent beings or not. And so the idea that we're intelligent is only an article of faith at that point. So I think this is like Tyler said, this is the easiest thing to point down, to put down. I think that the word worldview is highly abused these days. I would argue that there's only 4 worldviews, and that all 4 of those worldviews make definite truth claims. There's atheism, there's agnosticism, there's pantheism, and there's theism. And atheism is a worldview, and its central definite truth claim is God does not exist, or there is no God. There's no being that we could properly call God based on how we normally think about the term God. Agnosticism, hard agnosticism, is the belief that no one can know whether God exists, or that God is unknowable. Pantheism says that everything is God, the universe is God, God is the universe. Theism says that there is such a thing as a God or gods, and that's it. I think that those are the 4 logically exhaustive categories, and atheism is one of those worldviews, and all worldviews make definite truth claims. If they don't make definite truth claims, then they're nothing but an intellectual vacuum, and there's nothing for us to debate. So, but I'd be interested in hearing what Dale has to say about that.
Yeah, so I think on this front, in terms of the terminology, I definitely agree. I think that atheism is a positive claim and a positive worldview, whereby you're making a positive claim on your front to say that God does not exist, or at the very least probably does not exist. And I would use agnosticism for the term, where you're saying that you don't know, you don't have knowledge, and you just simply kind of lack belief. You're the neutral position. So it's interesting that Phil was saying that, like, you can't do that. You can't just lack belief in God. I don't know. I think that you can. Like, we just call that agnosticism and that sort of thing, right? Like,
yeah, and if the atheist defines atheism as a lack of belief in God, then atheism is indistinguishable from agnosticism, and suddenly our terminology is useless. So,
oh, sorry, go ahead.
If those 2 terms mean the same thing, then they're useless, and we have nothing to discuss. I believe in terminology that's useful and meaningful. And if those 2 things mean the same thing, then those terms are not useful, not meaningful. And I would argue that an atheist is not an agnostic, and an agnostic is not an atheist, because those are 2 separate worldviews and 2 separate truth claims. And the fact to say I don't believe in God is not agnosticism. Agnosticism is no one can know whether God exists or not. That's what agnosticism really is, as an ism. Because to say I believe this or I believe that, that's not an ism. That's simply me saying that I believe or don't believe in certain things. And so there's such a thing as an agnostic who says, I lack the belief in God. But agnosticism doesn't just say I lack the belief in God. Agnosticism says it is impossible to know whether God exists or not, and that is a universal claim about all of humanity. No one can know whether God exists or not. That's what agnosticism really is. And so I point that out in the book, and I make all sorts of observations about that. But one of the most important ones is, if we're going to have a debate and if we're going to have a real meaningful discussion, then we have to identify what these terms mean. And if we're going to mislabel them, and if we're going to misidentify what these terms mean, then we're not going to be very productive in our conversation. So
yeah. So that's interesting. I definitely see there are different positions. Like, when you say agnosticism, you're kind of saying a strong agnosticism position. I guess, would you deny that there are, like, people can be weak agnostics, or?
Well, I don't really use the term strong agnostic or weak agnostic, because the term agnostic means something different between those 2 when you make that distinction. Because when you say strong agnosticism is no one can know whether God exists, and then weak agnosticism means I don't know whether God exists, those are two separate claims, and those are two different definitions of the word agnostic. So I tend to avoid the whole concept of strong agnosticism and weak agnosticism because I think it can be unproductive if we're not real careful.
Yeah, I hear you on a practical stakes and that sort of thing. So I am open to the weak agnostic position. Like, I think it's a valid intellectual position to hold. But what I don't like, and on that front, same with atheism. I kind of, if you want, as long as you are clear and you define your terms, heck, you can call blue red, you can call, pink purple, whatever you want to, as long as for the purposes of a discussion, you are clear as to what you mean by a term. I'm happy to go along with that. But I do, when I use the terms, atheism is a positive claim. And what I would agree with you on is what I don't like with the new atheists and that sort of thing is they'll use this definition of atheism as a lack of belief in God as kind of a burden shifting tool. They will shift all of the burden of proof onto the theist, and they're just intellectually lazy. They don't want to make any claims or any proof or have any burden. And that seems to me, and yet they make positive claims in these debates. They just don't realize it, right? So it seems to me when it's hindering proper substantive discussion, that rubs me the wrong way in the same way it does with you. But I do accept the position of neutrality if in terms of lack of belief or a weak agnosticism. I think someone could be in that state.
Well, they can be in that state, and when somebody says, I lack the belief in God, there's nothing there for me to debate. Because if somebody says, I don't believe in God, or I lack the belief in God, I have no basis on which to challenge that proposition, because they're simply giving me a fact about what their internal mental state happens to be.
Yeah.
And I can't say, well, no, you actually do believe in God. You just don't know it. I mean, I can't debate somebody when they give me a subjective fact about what they believe inside their head.
Yeah.
Because that's simply indisputable. If somebody says I lack a belief in God, I can't argue with that because if I were to argue with it, I would say, I doubt that you lack a belief in God. And that's incoherent. You can't have a debate about that. So
here's a question as a follow-up. I totally agree with what you're saying 100%, but I know that there are some Christian presuppositionalists out there who will disagree with you, and they'll say, no, look, there is this dichotomy. If you claim you lack belief in God, that is equivalent to you making the positive claim that God doesn't exist. Like, people like Darth Dawkins, that sort of thing. How would you respond to a presuppositionalist who might say, no, this position just doesn't exist?
I would say that I would be able to. I think I can make a strong case that presuppositionalism and presuppositional apologetics is incoherent and circular, because I can't walk up to a person and say, you actually believe in God, you just don't know it. I think presuppositionalism is kind of a circular question begging position, and so I know there are lots of presuppositionalists. James White is a presuppositionalist, and there's someone else that frequently debates alongside of him, and I can't think of his name. I'm having a hard time thinking of people's names tonight for some reason. What's your name? Is your name Dale?
Yes. It helps that I have. Oh, the little label's gone. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Are you talking about Jeff Durbin?
Jeff Durbin, exactly. Jeff Durbin is a presuppositionalist, and in his debates, he will say, no, you actually believe in God, you just don't know it. Because the scriptures tell me that everyone knows that God exists and that they are without excuse. And I agree that that's true, but I can't use that in a debate. And so even though the presuppositionalist might say, I'm going to challenge your claim that you don't believe in God, I don't think that gets us anywhere. because it's logically possible that I could be wrong about my belief in the scripture. It may not be actual that I'm wrong about my belief in the scripture, but it's logically possible. And so therefore I can't beg the question and walk up to my debating opponent and tell them what they do or do not believe. So
Makes sense.
again, I think the idea I lack a belief in God is something that I have to treat as a fact, and that's not something I can debate, because I can't give somebody evidence that they actually do believe in God. And so for me, it's an unproductive position to take, and that's why I don't really give much credence to the weak agnostic phenomenon, because it's not a statement about reality. It's simply a statement about someone's internal mental states. And those are not up for debate. I'm not interested in debating those things. So I don't consider it an actual position. I consider it an internal mental state that somebody has, and something that I can't simply contradict and just tell them that they're wrong. That they're deluding themselves by thinking that they don't believe in God.
One last follow up, because I see Josh wants to close up and stuff, but just one last follow up. Let me kind of flip the script then, because sometimes Christians like William Lane Craig, for example, have in debates appealed to the inner witness of the Holy Spirit, which is a subjective evidence.
Mhm.
I've appealed to properly basic beliefs myself. From the Holy Spirit, do you think that that's equally unproductive? Because how is an atheist supposed to argue against that, or is there a difference?
It depends on the context. I think it's unproductive in a debate, but I think it could be very meaningful for the Christian to have the subjective experience of the Holy Spirit in their lives. But they have to combine that with the objective verification of the truth of Christianity and the truth of the Bible and the truth of the existence of the Holy Spirit to begin with. So I think it's meaningful. I celebrate William Lane Craig when he says, I have the subjective experience of the Holy Spirit, and that is confirmation of my Christian faith. I celebrate that. I encourage that. I think it's a wonderful. I believe that I had the same experience, but if that was all I had to rely on, then I think I'd be lost at that point. I think that the subjective witness of the Holy Spirit has to be combined with the objective historical evidence for the Christian faith taken in its totality. And so all of those things can be confirmation for one's personal faith, but that particular point is not very productive in a debate with an atheist.
Gotcha. Awesome. Thank you so much. Yeah, Josh, over to you.
Well, I actually vaguely touched on this earlier in our first objection that we covered. We were talking about morality and not needing God to be moral, and I was mentioning the worldview problem and said sometimes atheists will object and say that their atheism is in fact not a worldview. And my response to that was, in fact, even if the atheism itself as a feature isn't the worldview wholesale, it is nested in a worldview that is organized and informed by that proposition. That is just how all of this works. Your beliefs are not disjointed boxes that you get to cut and sever from one another for convenience. Really, all of our thoughts and beliefs about our thoughts and so forth actually are webbed together. And some of this is in fact disjointed. And when there's disjointed beliefs and thoughts, that usually illustrates that either there's a gap in knowledge or we're wrong or both, right? So ultimately, what we're doing in pointing out something like, atheism is not a worldview, it's a lack of belief, and then answering that with, yeah, you're just wrong about that, is really to point out your ideas have price tags. Okay. And the entailments of the assertion that you're making, or the lack of assertion that you're making, your refusal to have a positive stance on whatever, and simply making a statement about your personal belief right now, that's cool. You can say, I lack a belief in God. And my response simply could be, I'm a Christian. And that's of the same, like, it's the same answer. It doesn't go anywhere. And so there's not really much substance to saying that if somebody's trying to have a worldview discussion and says your atheistic worldview, and the response is atheism isn't a worldview. I believe that's of the same kind of argument as people who will get, and I might ruffle some feathers with this. I think that's on the same level as Christians who say Christianity is not a religion, it's a relationship, and then leave that there. It doesn't go anywhere when you say that. Right? It doesn't really mean anything to the person on the opposite end of the table. So you have to say what that actually entails to you and why that makes a difference, if that's going to be part of the discussion. Otherwise, it's really rather irrelevant, and it's just like where you are personally with your situation right now. And it's like at that point, it's not like you said, it's not really a debate. It's a matter of opinion or experience, right? I can say I have the experience of being colder in the morning than I am in the afternoon, and somebody can say, no, you don't. To which I would say, okay, says who? Like I'm telling you my experience, you're telling, and it's like, to argue that would be silly. Like, honestly, it's not. So we're not arguing that you lack or have whatever in order to say that atheism is part of or nested in or informs the whole of a worldview. That's ultimately what we mean, is that atheism is one of the marked characteristics of the worldview you do in fact have. And in fact, that proposition informs a lot of things about your worldview. That's very expansive. And so that's what we mean, is your worldview is nested in something, and the things inside your worldview are nested in that worldview. And so, like, what you're doing, like let's say to bring this out as a Christian, my worldview is that God exists, right? That's my entire worldview is nested within that proposition on the grandest scale. Within that, I believe I'm made in the image of God, and my worldview is nested in that proposition. And you can get more and more particular on different levels, but ultimately, almost everything that is entailed by my worldview has to be either compatible or incompatible with those things, because those are the fundamental ground floor of most of the things that I believe or think. And so when I'm inconsistent with those things, the atheist would be right to point it out to me. And I actually appreciate oftentimes when atheists are like, that didn't sound very much like what Jesus would say, did it? Right? Oh, you're not very Jesus-y. And they think that's something that should be a defeater. And it's like, no, actually, that's kind of the premise of why I think salvation is necessary, is that I'm in fact not there. I need to have this process of becoming, right? And so ultimately, that pointing it out, that incompatibility, it's like I'm living towards something. My worldview actually informs my living. And that's why all this is actually even important in the first place, is that all of these things impact your actual living, your actual doing, your actual thinking and behaving, the living part of you, right? These are all impacted by the worldview that you actually have, right? And so even if atheism itself isn't the worldview, it is in fact a very informative portion of what we mean by the worldview, if not the thing that the worldview is nested in. That's what we mean. And so I don't know if you have anything to add to that, guys.
I just wanted to back up. This was something I forgot to say when I was kind of agreeing with Phil about, just be upfront with your definitions, how you're using these words for debate purposes, for practical, because I remember being frustrated, not even with just the atheism, but I did prepared for a debate with an atheist. I think it was on Robert Stanley's show on Jesus mythicism. So, like, obviously when I say that word, Jesus mythicist, I think everyone knows what the common definition of that is. But when I got to the debate, he used that as a trick, and he actually argued that even I was a Jesus mythicist. Like he said, if you disagree or have a different view than anything on the Gospels, I kind of agreed with Craig Evans' take on the I am statement. So he's like, well, technically, you're a Jesus mythicist too, because you're not arguing the standard fullness of the inerrancy of the Gospels and taken literally as it is and stuff like that. So he kind of redefined what a Jesus mythicist is, not to be someone who denies the historical Jesus, but someone who denies anything written in the Gospels or something like that, or has a different interpretation of a verse than his what he learned about the Gospels in Christianity. And that was such a little trick, a deceitful little trick to throw me off in the debate. Like, no, tell me what you mean. I'll debate. If that's what you want to debate, fine. But give me, if we're going to have a substantive conversation, like, be upfront about what you mean by this term, because I don't think anyone here, even the Jesus mythicists, would have understood mythicism to mean that, right? So, yeah.
Well, I would. I mentioned in the book that that the term atheism has nothing to do with what anybody believes. It's not the term atheism means a meaning without, and theism or theo meaning God. So atheism means without God-ism. In other words, it is a worldview. It's a positive worldview, and the central proposition of that worldview is that ultimate reality consists of a state of affairs where, or an entire universe or a cosmos or whatever, that does not include the existence of some kind of supreme being that we normally call God. And I argue that a worldview, the definition of a worldview is that it is a set of propositions that describe ultimate reality. In other words, this is what ultimate reality is like. And atheism says ultimate reality is without God, theos, without God. And so therefore, atheism is a worldview. And if you want to include agnosticism as a worldview, then agnosticism has to make a positive truth claim. I don't believe in God is not a positive truth claim about reality. It's simply a claim about somebody's mental states. And so the worldview of agnosticism says ultimate reality consists of a set of beings that are incapable of knowing what the nature of ultimate reality is, and by extension, they're incapable of knowing whether or not there's such a thing as this thing that we call God. So that's where I think it's most productive for us to define a worldview. I wish worldviews were not called that, because some people consider a worldview as an ideology about what the world around us is like and what life is like. What's life like in the United States? What's life like? So the differences between life in the United States and life in France, that's our worldview. We view that our perception of the world is different depending on where we live and what environment we happen to be in. That's not a worldview. And so I wish that worldviews were called ultimate reality views instead of worldviews, because in the term worldview, the word world means ultimate reality. It's our view of ultimate reality and our description of what ultimate reality consists of. And anything else can easily become counterproductive and confusing. And I like to avoid confusion as much as we possibly can. So that's kind of, that's kind of my position on a nutshell. I'm not the last word on the subject, but I think that having said all those things has proved to be very productive for me in my discourse, in discourse with Christians and non-Christians alike, so.
Right on. Well, I appreciate it, man. Thank you 100% for coming on. I'm so glad I was on here for this stream. I was in the live chat for the last stream that you were on, especially the really long one. Kudos for the Olympic level stream. But I really appreciate your time and your attention and your participation in the discussion here. And I had a really great time. It's nice always to be on here with Dale also. He's somebody who I find personally challenging, and I really like it. We agree on so much, and then he says things and I'm like, so it's just like, it's cool to be able to like really consider stuff in a way that like is sometimes a little bit more detailed than I probably would have gotten on any one particular facet of something. It's always nice to be able to do that.
Awesome. Okay, I thought your original reaction was like, you're like, oh, huh, that's crazy. Just
No. Well, what I'm saying is oftentimes if you'll offer something and say, well, what do you think about this? And then you'll listen and be like, well, actually, I was thinking this part, and it's like, oh yeah, I wasn't even going that direction. Yeah, okay, like and then it changes what you're actually considering at the time, because half the time, I think most of what we see when we receive a question is what we think rather than what is being asked. And so it's really a cool schooling lesson to be asked a question, give an answer, the answer makes sense, and still not be the answer to the question. And then you get to answer a completely different question after that. It's like that's something that I really enjoy. I think that's something that I gain from.
I really want to say what I said last time Dale and I were on together. And is every time I'm on with Dale, I always learn something from Dale. And so, I mean, hats off to you, brother. It helps challenge me, and it helps keep me humble. And it just reminds me that there's so much more to think about on these things. And Dale always comes up with more things to think about on these issues, and he comes up with things that I haven't thought about. So that is a huge bonus having Dale on. I would like to have Dale on every time I come on the show. I want Dale on with me.
Awesome. Yeah, I will make that happen. Yeah, because I love talking.
We could probably hook that up.
Josh, I love talking to you. Tyler, David Russell, not so much. No, no, I love all of you guys. We're all brothers, and yeah, I learn from you guys, and it helps me too to try to articulate my beliefs and trying to figure out where do I agree with Phil, where do I disagree, and stuff like that. And it's great to kind of interact and engage and correct myself too when I get something wrong. I remember the last debate we did on can God lie. I turns out I was wrong, so that's amazing. I learned that I was totally wrong, and I've got absolute knowledge on that front. God can't lie. Yeah, so that's awesome.
Well, Dale, you're just not allowed to disagree with me because I'm always right. and in fact, I thought I was wrong once, but it turns out I was mistaken.
Well,
that's a good one.
Oh, that's a good one. Well, I'm an aphilist. I lack the belief that Phil is always right. So you need to.
you're an Phil is always rightist.
Yes.
Well, I got to let you know that I am secretly one of those as well. I just don't like to tell people.
Okay. Good stuff. For me, I don't lack belief. I know Dale is often wrong. So yeah. I'll make the positive claim there. But.
And nobody knows better than my wife that Phil is not always right.
Oh man. Well, as a parting gift to you, I have actually one last question from my best friend and neighbor, Steven. He says, what is the name of the book that you read in college? The one that you said that was gifted to you that was really impactful. What was the name of that book?
That was called How Should We Then Live by Francis Schaeffer.
Nice. Okay. I'll make sure that he gets that because I know he was watching at the beginning of the stream. I'm not sure he's here now.
But if I were to recommend what I think is some of his best books, I wouldn't recommend that book first.
Okay.
I think his two of his best books, I believe, are The God Who Is There and Escape from Reason. I think those are his two best books by far. But coming in a close third is He Is There and He Is Not Silent. And it's about the necessity of revelation in human epistemology. So Dr. Schaeffer has been a huge, huge influence on my life. And the ironic thing is he was a presuppositionalist.
Wow. How about that?
So I never dismissed presuppositionalism entirely, because if I did that, then I feel like I would be doing a disservice to Dr. Schaeffer, but I think that presuppositionalism does have a place in Christian apologetics, but I tend to favor classical apologetics over presuppositionalism. But yeah, that was the book. It's a great book, but I think that the God Who Is There, Escape from Reason, He Is There and He Is Not Silent, I think are better. So.
Right on. Well, I appreciate it, man. And again, I thank you 100% for your time. This has been really awesome. I'm surprised we're almost at the 3-hour mark. That was really, really fast. I have no idea how we're almost at the 3-hour mark. I feel like the clock is lying to me right now. But yeah, anybody who's watched us to the end, or anybody watching this afterward, thank you. Please like the video. If you want to subscribe to the channel, go ahead and subscribe. If you like to support our ministry, you can use the super chat feature, or afterward the super sticker feature, or we have links to the PayPal and all that stuff down underneath in the description. And we have a link to Phil's book in the description. And if you guys have any future show recommendations or something that you'd like to see us discuss, go ahead and leave that down in the comments below as well. We do read them. I interact with them pretty regularly. So yeah, come engage with us. And we do open mics at least once a month. So if you'd like to come on and talk with us, if you have some equipment and you're willing to do that, go ahead. We're totally open. Just be respectful and watch your language, and come on to have a good discussion and not to be an asshat. So that, I would say, if anybody wants to be a guest on the show or join us for one of those things, check out an open mic night, and from there we might be able to strike up a better conversation and learn some stuff from you guys in the audience as well. So thank you for your time and your attention. And in the spirit of my brother Tyler, who is no longer here, good night, God bless, and stay like Christ.